I turned a corrupt homeowners association president's attempt to steal my dead grandfather's house into a federal investigation that cost him his career, his savings, and his own home. Most people think an HOA is just about keeping the grass cut and making sure you do not park your car on the street. But in my neighborhood, the association was a weapon used by a man named Dave to prey on the weak. I moved into my grandfather's house 3 years ago after he passed away. It was a beautiful, modest ranch-style home on a large corner lot with mature oak trees and a garden my grandfather had spent 40 years perfecting. To me, it was a sanctuary full of memories. But to Dave, it was a line item on a spreadsheet that he wanted for himself. Dave was the kind of man who walked around the neighborhood every morning with a literal yardstick and a digital camera. He was 60 years old, retired from a mid-level management job he never stopped talking about, and he treated the neighborhood like his own private kingdom. Within my first week of moving in, Dave was at my door. He did not come to offer condolences or a welcome basket. He stood on my porch, looked at his watch, and told me that my moving truck had been parked in the driveway for 6 hours, which was 4 hours past the limit for commercial vehicles. When I tried to explain that I was still unloading my life, he simply tapped his clipboard and said that rules are what keep us from living in a jungle. Over the next few months, I realized that Dave was not just a stickler for rules. He was a bully who used the HOA bylaws as a tool for extortion. He had a specific group of cronies on the board who did whatever he said. They would target elderly residents who could not keep up with their yard work or young families who did not have the money for expensive renovations. Dave would issue fine after fine for the smallest infractions. A weed in the flower bed was $50, a slightly faded mailbox was $100. If you did not pay within 10 days, the fines doubled. If you still did not pay, Dave would slap a lien on your house. Dave's entitlement was breathtaking. He lived in the largest house in the cul-de-sac, and strangely enough, his lawn was never perfectly manicured, and his roof was missing several shingles. Yet, he was the one signing the violation notices for everyone else. One afternoon, I saw him yelling at a woman named Sarah, who lived 2 doors down. Sarah was a single mother working 2 jobs, and her young son had left a small plastic tricycle on the sidewalk for 20 minutes while they went inside to get a drink. Dave was standing over the tricycle red-faced, screaming at this woman that her lack of discipline was devaluing his property. When she started to cry, Dave did not soften. He told her that if she could not afford to follow the rules, she should move to a trailer park. That was the moment I realized Dave was not just a jerk, he was a predator. I'm a forensic accountant by trade. My entire job consists of looking at numbers, finding patterns, and identifying where money has gone missing. When Dave started sending me notices about my grandfather's trees being a nuisance because they dropped leaves on the sidewalk, I did not just rake the leaves. I started asking questions. I asked to see the HOA financial records, which by law any member of the association is allowed to audit. Dave's response was a cold, smug smile. He told me that the records were private and that a kid like me wouldn't understand them anyway. He started calling me the renter, even though I owned the house outright. He would tell neighbors that I was bringing down the neighborhood's prestige. The harassment escalated when I received a formal notice stating that my grandfather's house had an illegal guest suite in the back. It was not a guest suite. It was a detached garage that had been there since 1970. Dave claimed it violated a new zoning bylaw, passed by the board, and demanded I tear it down at my own expense or face a $500 daily fine. When I refused, the legal war began. Dave thought he was dealing with an emotional grandson who would crumble under pressure. He had no idea that I spent my days taking down white-collar criminals much smarter than him. He wanted my house because it was the most valuable lot in the neighborhood, and he had already told a local developer friend of his that he could get me out within a year. Dave felt entitled to my inheritance, my peace of mind, and my future. He was about to find out that when you try to take someone's home, you better make sure you don't leave a paper trail. The legal notices started arriving like clockwork every Tuesday morning. Dave had realized that I was not going to be intimidated by a simple conversation on my porch, so he decided to bury me in paperwork and financial stress. The first major incident happened just a month after our initial confrontation. I had spent the entire weekend meticulously cleaning the exterior of the house, power washing the siding, and trimming the hedges to ensure they were exactly the height specified in the 100-page handbook. On Monday morning, I woke up to find a bright orange sticker plastered to my front door. It stated that I was in violation of the neighborhood aesthetic code because my curtains, which were the same ones my grandfather had used for years, were off-white instead of the mandatory pure white. I decided to try the peaceful route. I walked over to Dave's house that evening with a copy of the bylaws and a sample of the fabric. I knocked on his door, and when he opened it, he didn't even invite me in. He stood behind his screen door, looking down his nose at me while holding a glass of expensive scotch. I calmly explained that the bylaws actually stated that window coverings must be a neutral color and that off-white fell perfectly within that category. Dave didn't even look at the fabric sample. He told me that as the president of the board, he was the final word on what constituted a neutral color. He said that my grandfather had been given a pass because he was old and dying, but that the grace period for the property ended the moment his heart stopped beating. He then leaned in close to the screen and told me that every day those curtains stayed up, I would be charged $50. I asked him why he was doing this, and he simply said that some people belong in this community and some people do not, and it was his job to filter out the trash. 2 weeks later, the situation turned from annoying to malicious. I came home from work to find a professional landscaping crew in my backyard. They were in the process of cutting down the 3 massive oak trees that my grandfather had planted when my father was a boy. I ran out there screaming for them to stop. The foreman showed me a work order signed by Dave on behalf of the HOA. The order claimed the trees were infested with a dangerous fungus that threatened the entire neighborhood's ecosystem and that they had been deemed an emergency hazard. I knew for a fact those trees were healthy. I had a certified arborist check them just months prior. I managed to stop the crew before they reached the second tree, but the first one, a 60-year-old giant, was already half-gutted. I called the police, but when they arrived, Dave was already there waiting for them. He presented a forged document that looked like a city ordinance claiming the board had the right to enter private property for environmental emergencies. The police told me it was a civil matter and that they couldn't do anything because Dave had what appeared to be legal authorization. Dave stood on the sidewalk as the police drove away, smirking at me. He told me that the cost of the tree removal would be added to my HOA dues as a special assessment. It was $5,000. When I told him I would sue him into the ground, he laughed. He reminded me that the HOA had a massive legal defense fund paid for by my own dues and he could keep me in court until I was bankrupt. The third incident was the breaking point. It was a rainy Thursday and I was preparing for a big audit at work. I heard a loud thud against my house and ran to the window. Dave was standing in my driveway with a can of spray paint. He was marking large X's on my driveway in the side of my garage. When I ran outside, he told me that the board had held an emergency meeting the night before, which I was conveniently not invited to, where they decided that my driveway was structurally unsound. He claimed that the cracks, which were barely visible, posed a trip hazard for the mail carrier. He informed me that I had 48 hours to have the entire driveway torn up and repaved by a specific contractor he recommended. If I didn't, the HOA would hire the contractor themselves, do the work, and place a lien on my house for the cost, plus a 30% administrative fee. I realized then that Dave wasn't just trying to annoy me, he was trying to create enough debt to trigger a foreclosure. He knew that if I had $20,000 in unpaid fines and assessments, the HOA could legally seize the property. I looked at the contractor's name on the flyer he handed me. It was a company owned by his brother-in-law. The web of corruption was starting to show its threads. I stopped arguing. I didn't yell. I didn't threaten him. I simply looked him in the eye and thanked him for the information. Dave seemed confused by my sudden compliance. He thought he had finally broken my spirit. He told me he was glad I was finally learning my place, and that maybe if I was lucky, he would let me stay long enough to pack my things properly. As he walked away, I didn't go back inside to cry or call a lawyer. I went to my home office and opened my laptop. I used my credentials to access public tax records, corporate filings, and property histories. I spent the next 8 hours straight digging into the HOA's history. I found that over the last 5 years, 4 other houses had been foreclosed on by the association under Dave's leadership. All 4 of those houses had been sold at auction for half their value to the same investment group. When I looked up the owners of that investment group, I found a series of shell companies. But at the very center of the web was Dave's wife. He wasn't just a bully. He was running a house-stealing syndicate. He would target people, bury them in fraudulent fines, use his brother-in-law's company to create massive bills, and then have his wife buy the houses at a discount to flip them for a profit. He had done it to a widow, a disabled veteran, and 2 young families. He thought I was next. He had no idea that I was currently downloading every bank statement the HOA had ever produced. He thought he was playing a game of power, but I was playing a game of math, and the numbers never lie. I stayed up until the sun came up, building a spreadsheet that would serve as his professional death warrant. Every cent he had stolen, every forged signature, and every kickback was being logged. The slow burn was over. Now it was time for the fire. The turning point came on a Tuesday afternoon while I was at the office finishing a high-stakes audit for a major client. I received a frantic call from my neighbor Sarah, the single mother Dave had been harassing. She was crying so hard I could barely understand her. She told me that a demolition crew was at my house with a backhoe and they were currently tearing down the detached garage. This was the building Dave had claimed was an illegal guest suite, the one I had explicitly told him was a grandfathered structure. I dropped everything and drove home like a madman, my heart hammering against my ribs. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the damage was done. The roof of the garage had been caved in and the sidewalls were reduced to splinters and twisted metal. Dave was standing in my yard wearing a bright yellow construction vest and holding a clipboard as if he were a city official. He was laughing with the foreman of the crew. When I jumped out of my car and ran toward him, he didn't even flinch. He held up a hand and told me to stay back for my own safety. He claimed that because I had failed to comply with the demolition order within the 48-hour window he had arbitrarily set, the board had exercised its right to self-help under a modified bylaw. He told me that since the structure was a fire hazard, they didn't need a court order to remove it. But it wasn't just the building. Inside that garage were all of my grandfather's remaining personal belongings that I hadn't yet moved into the main house. There were hand-carved furniture pieces he had made for my grandmother, boxes of family photographs from the 1940s, and his vintage tool collection that he had used to teach me how to build things when I was a boy. The backhoe had crushed those boxes into the dirt. I saw a framed photo of my father as a child, the glass shattered and the image torn, poking out from under a pile of broken drywall. When I pointed to the wreckage of my family's history, Dave just shrugged. He told me that if the items were important, I should have kept them in a legal structure. Then he handed me a bill for $12,000 for the emergency demolition services provided by his brother-in-law's company. He looked me right in the eyes and told me that he had already filed the lien with the county that morning. He said that with the previous fines and the tree removal fees, I now owed the association over $20,000. He told me that I had 30 days to pay in full or he would begin the foreclosure process. He leaned in and whispered that he already had a buyer lined up who liked the lot size and that I should start looking for an apartment across town where people like me belonged. I didn't scream, I didn't swing at him. A strange cold clarity washed over me. I realized that Dave wasn't a person you could reason with or fight through standard channels. He had spent 20 years corrupting the very system meant to protect the homeowners. He owned the board. He manipulated the local contractors. And he knew how to move just fast enough to bypass the slow wheels of the civil courts. If I sued him normally, it would take 2 years and he would use HOA funds to fight me. By then, my house would be gone and he would have moved on to his next victim. I realized that to stop a predator like Dave, I had to stop treating this like a neighborly dispute and start treating it like the criminal enterprise it was. I went inside my house and locked the door. I walked past the boxes of my life and sat down at my desk. My hands were perfectly steady. I am a forensic accountant. I find people who think they're clever enough to hide money in the shadows. Dave was a big fish in a very small pond, and he had become arrogant. Arrogance leads to mistakes. And Dave had left a trail of breadcrumbs a mile wide because he never expected anyone to actually look at the ledger. I spent the next 72 hours straight working. I didn't sleep. I survived on coffee and pure, focused rage. I used my professional access to deep dive into the HOA's bank accounts, which I had managed to gain entry to by finding the login credentials in a stack of old board meeting minutes Dave had foolishly left in a public digital folder. I traced every single check written by the HOA over the last decade. I found that the association was paying triple the market rate for landscaping, snow removal, and legal fees. All of that. Money was being funneled into companies that had been registered only months before the contracts were signed. The smoking gun was a series of wire transfers. Dave was taking the fine money paid by residents and moving it into a reserve fund that didn't exist. From there, the money was moved into a private account held by a shell company in Delaware. I tracked the registration of that shell company back to a physical address that matched a vacation home Dave owned in Florida. He wasn't just overcharging for repairs. He was straight up stealing the monthly dues of 300 families to fund his retirement. I also found the evidence of the rigged elections. I contacted the previous board members who had been ousted and found that Dave had discarded hundreds of ballots in the last 3 election cycles to ensure his hand-picked cronies stayed in power. He had created a shadow government in our suburbs. I spent the final night of my investigation compiling everything into a 300-page report. I had copies of the forged demolition orders, the fake environmental reports about my trees, the kickback receipts from his brother-in-law, and the bank statements showing the embezzlement of over $400,000. I didn't go to the police yet. I knew that if I just filed a report, Dave might get tipped off and destroy the physical records. I needed a public execution of his reputation and his power. The annual HOA general meeting was scheduled for the following Thursday. It was the one time a year that the entire neighborhood gathered in the community center. Dave thought this meeting would be his victory lap, where he would announce the foreclosure on my property and cement his control. He had no idea that I was about to turn that meeting into a courtroom where he was the only one on trial. I sent a blind copy of my report to the state attorney's office and the IRS Criminal Investigation Division with a cover letter stating that a public confession was imminent. The trap was set. Dave wanted to take my home, so I was going to take his freedom. I spent the next 6 days operating with the clinical precision of a surgeon. I knew that simply presenting the evidence wouldn't be enough to stop a man who had spent 20 years perfecting his lies. I had to ensure there was no escape path, no way for him to claim a misunderstanding, and no way for his cronies to protect him. I took a week of leave from my firm, telling my boss that I was dealing with a family emergency. In a way, I was protecting the last thing my grandfather had left me. My first move was to contact the 4 families Dave had successfully pushed out of the neighborhood over the last 5 years. I tracked them down using public records. One was an elderly widow named Mary, who was now living in a tiny assisted living facility because Dave had foreclosed on her over a roof repair she couldn't afford. When I told her what I had found, she cried. She gave me copies of every threatening letter Dave had ever sent her. I did the same with the others. By the end of the week, I had a dozen sworn affidavits from former residents detailing Dave's patterns of intimidation, forged signatures, and illegal fines. Next, I went after the money. Being a forensic accountant gives you a certain set of skills when it comes to following a digital trail. I discovered that Dave's brother-in-law, the contractor who had destroyed my garage, wasn't just overcharging the HOA. He was billing for work that was never performed. I found invoices for a clubhouse renovation that cost $60,000. Yet, when I walked through the clubhouse with a hidden camera, I could see the same 20-year-old carpet and peeling paint. I cross-referenced these invoices with the HOA bank statements and found that the money was paid out. Then 40% of it was immediately transferred back into an account controlled by Dave's wife. This was a textbook kickback scheme. I didn't stop there. I knew the board members were just as guilty for looking the other way. I spent 3 nights digging into their personal finances and found that Dave was paying for their loyalty. He was using HOA funds to pay for the board treasurer's private landscaping and the secretary's new pool deck, all disguised as community maintenance. I had them all dead to rights. I compiled every check, every invoice, and every forged document into 20 identical binders. I also created a digital presentation that would be impossible to ignore. The day before the annual meeting, I made a trip to the local precinct. I didn't just talk to a beat cop. I met with a detective I knew from a previous corporate fraud case I had worked on. I laid out the evidence of the embezzlement, the wire fraud, and the racketeering. He was stunned by the scale of the theft in such a small community. He coordinated with the state attorney's office, and we agreed on a plan. They wouldn't move in until I gave the signal, ensuring that Dave would have the opportunity to lie on the record first. In my state, the HOA meeting is legally considered a corporate proceeding, and lying about financial matters in that setting carries heavy penalties. I also hired a private security firm, not for protection, but to serve as process servers. I wanted every member of that board to be served with a massive civil lawsuit the exact moment the criminal evidence was revealed. I wanted to hit them from every possible angle at once. I wanted them to feel the same suffocating walls closing in that they had forced on so many others. The final piece of the trap was the media. I contacted a local investigative reporter who specialized in corruption. I told her I had a story about a massive suburban crime ring masquerading as a homeowners association. I showed her a glimpse of the bank records, and she was hooked. She agreed to attend the meeting with a hidden camera crew, promising to keep it under wraps until the confrontation began. On the night of the meeting, I dressed in my best suit. I felt a strange sense of calm. I wasn't the grieving grandson anymore. I was the wolf at the door. I arrived at the community center early and saw Dave at the front of the room looking smug and triumphant. He was wearing an expensive watch I knew was paid for by our neighborhood dues. He saw me walk in and chuckled to the treasurer, probably thinking I was there to beg for more time on my debt. He even had the audacity to nod at me, a king acknowledging a peasant. I sat in the back row and waited. I watched as the room filled up with my neighbors, people who had been bullied, fined, and silenced for years. They looked defeated. They looked like they expected another hour of Dave barking orders and raising their fees. Dave stood up at the podium, tapped the microphone, and flashed a predatory smile. He announced that the first item on the agenda was the special assessment for property dereliction, specifically targeting my house. He began a slideshow of the garage he had destroyed, calling it a victory for property values.